All right, hello everyone, and welcome to another installment of Draco Sinister by Cassandra Clare. I apologize that this is coming so late in the month, but realistically, the closer we get to the end of this particular book, just the more craziness I am finding within the chapters. So I had to edit not only this chapter again, but the chapter after it to make sure that everything was very cohesive, and it wasn't, so I had to do some work before I could release this. So, without further ado, let's just get right into it. Chapter 12. The Persistence of Memory. Charlie was never actually sure exactly what it was that suddenly woke him up in the middle of the night. Later, he would think it was a vague feeling of uneasiness, the sense that all was not right with the world. More likely, it was a sudden craving for chocolate biscuits. He got up and pulled on a pair of flannel pajamas, bottoms, and t-shirt, and headed downstairs to the kitchen, padding quietly on bare feet. Once there, he lit the fire under the teapot on the stove with the flick of his wand, and summoned a pack of biscuits from the cupboard and began eating them methodically, glancing absently at the clock on the wall as he did so. The kettle began to boil. He reached out and plucked it off the stove, then paused and looked at the clock on the wall again. Bang! The kettle hit the ground as Charlie's suddenly nerveless fingers released their grasp on the handle, and boiling water splashed his feet. But he barely noticed. Moving quickly across the room towards the wall where the gold-framed clock hung, he leaned his head back and stared at it with an incomprehension that bordered on shock. There was each gold hand with the name of a Weasley child or parent etched on it. Percy said, "Work," Bill's "Home," and Fred and George seemed to be at a wild party, don't wait up. His own hand was set firmly on visiting family. But Ron and Ginny's hands, they were doing something Charlie had never seen before in his entire life. They were spinning in wild circular sweeps around the face of the clock, over and over, directionless and unceasing, as if wherever his little brother and sister had gone, it was somewhere so far that even the magic of the clock couldn't find them. "Demons, demons, demons," Narcissa said, pushing the heavy book back across the table to Sirius. "What a title." "That's what I said," grinned Sirius. Narcissa smiled back at him and touched the cover of the book lightly with the palm of her hand. "Where did you get this, anyway?" "Snape," said Sirius, looking pleased with himself. "You told Severus about the demon in the cellar?" Narcissa was surprised. "Severus," mimicked Sirius good-humoredly. "You know, I never hear anyone call him Severus, except Dumbledore." "If I recall, you used to call him Bossface," said Lupin, appearing in the doorway. "On good days," admitted Sirius amicably, swiveling around to greet his friend. Lupin had put on clean clothes to replace the ones he had torn during the change, and although he could, by no means, be described as looking well-rested and relaxed, he did appear much improved. "You ready to go?" he asked Sirius. Sirius nodded. "And where are you two off to?" Narcissa interjected with asperity. "Godric's Hollow," replied Sirius, getting to his feet. "Remus has a theory that the box my key fits is somewhere there, and I think he's got a point." "Godric's Hollow?" Narcissa looked up at Sirius. "Isn't that—" "Yes," he said shortly, pulling on his long grey travelling cloak. Sirius's tone discouraged inquiry, so instead Narcissa got to her feet, put her hands on his shoulders, and kissed him goodbye. Come back soon.
Will do. Owl me if you find anything interesting in that book.
I will, she said, and waved at him as he disapparated, along with Lupin. Harry sat on the floor of the cell with his arms behind him. He didn't have much choice in the matter, as they were manacled and fastened via a length of chain to an adamantine hoop sunk deep into the floor. He couldn't stand up, and couldn't move more than a foot away from the wall. It was not comfortable. His clothes were torn and stiff with blood. He itched all over, and his mind was spinning. He heard Draco's voice in his head, telling Slytherin that he was tired of fighting him. Had he been serious? Or just playing along so that the Snake Lord wouldn't kill him right off? Either way, he hadn't felt this bad about anything since he had thought he'd lost Hermione forever. Lost her to Draco through his own stupidity and blindness. Still, there was a tiny, nagging voice in the back of his head that said that Draco had only done what he had to do. He hadn't looked particularly happy about doing it either. Suddenly, Harry jerked against his chains as his vision went black. The world peeled down the center like an orange, and he suddenly saw Ron, Hermione, and Ginny as clearly as if they stood in front of him. Heard the screaming rattle of wind, saw Hermione gripping Ron and Ginny's hands tightly, her eyes searching, and suddenly she saw him. She screamed out his name once, then the world closed itself back up, and they were gone, and the only sound left in the room was his own ragged breathing and the rattle of the chains around his wrists. After the guards had dragged Harry out of the room, Fleur turned back to Draco and her master. Slytherin stood with his heir over the dead body of the Manticore, and as she watched, he held out his hand, and Draco allowed him to take the sword from his grasp. He raised it high overhead and brought it down hard. It sliced through the Manticore's armored belly as easily as a knife slices a loaf of bread. Slytherin then drew the sword back, and the Manticore's belly gaped open, blood pouring across the floor like a fountain. Fleur felt a tinny ringing beginning in her ears. She was tired, so tired. Salazar and Draco began to waver in front of her, as if she were looking at them through disturbed water. As the blood on the floor ran towards her, she saw Draco glance in her direction, as the world flipped upside down, and the floor rushed up to meet her. And then there was blackness. When she finally awoke, she was lying on something soft, and, rolling sideways, she realized it was a bed. The room she was in was familiar as well. It was the room she had first slept in since her arrival here at the castle. Great swatches of dark material hung from the bedposts and covered the windows, leaving the room lit only by the sputtering light of the torches that hung in metal brackets on the walls. A tapestry that depicted a huge green serpent strangling a lion hung over the grate, in which a blazing fire billowed gold and red. And sitting next to the fire, half hidden in the depths of an enormous armchair, was Draco. He had had time to wash and clean himself up, his hands and face free of blood, and his silver hair shining clean and damp tendrils against his temples. His skin was very pale, his eyes dark and smudged underneath with blue shadows, but he looked composed. Instead of his soiled clothing, which he had worn to fight the Manticore, he now wore something that was made of some tough, unfamiliar black material, black boots that looked to be a size too big, and over that, a long black cloak with dark green piping that fastened across the chest with a silver chain whose links were tiny, interlaced serpents wound around the neck. He raised his eyebrows at her as she sat up. "That was quite a dramatic feat you accomplished. Well done." She sat up, hugging her arms to herself and shivering. "What are you doing here, Draco?"
I was told this was my room.
This is my room. He grinned, a narrow grin like a knife blade. Apparently we're meant to share. Isn't that sweet? Draco swung a leg up over the arm of the chair and leaned back. The torchlight struck bright sparks off his silver hair. Fleur glanced where his gaze had gone and saw, without surprise, one of the grey-robed servants of Slytherin standing in the corner of the room, silent, face hidden by its hood. Suddenly, Draco leapt out of his chair, a beautiful forward spring that took him to his feet and across the room within seconds. He approached the grey-robed servant and cleared his throat. The servant looked up at him, his face still hidden in thick shadow under the folds of the robe, and said nothing. "What are you?" asked Draco with cat-like curiosity, ducking his head and trying to see under the hood. "Vampire? Goblin? Sad, pathetic little werewolf?" It raised its head, and this time its hood slid back, and Fleur caught an unpleasant glimpse of scaly white skin and large pinkish red eyes. "Aha! Nasty creature. Unknown origin. There seem to be a lot of you around these parts. Did you get cold here?" The creature was silent, but it gave him an apprehensive look. "I implore you to share." Draco took a few steps back, his look of consideration taking on a murderous edge. "No? Then get out!" The servant didn't move. "I said, get out," said Draco haughtily, all his years of having house elves doting on his every whim rising up and spilling into his voice. "I'm the heir of Slytherin, you know. I will command the armies of the Snake Lord. It might be wise to stay on my good side." "Master," it began in a rather unappealing, hissy voice. Draco looked approving. "That's the spirit. Now, run me an errand, will you? Get me a Mai Tai." The creature looked bewildered. "A Mai Tai?" Draco nodded energetically. "A Mai Tai. I hear it's a rather fancy muggle drink. I want one. With an umbrella, and don't come back until you've got one. I don't care if you have to go to London for it. I'm the heir of Slytherin, and my whims must be served." He reached out and jerked the door open, ushering the creature out with a wave of his free hand. It went slowly, looking very dubious. "That's right, trot along now," said Draco, closing the door after its retreating back. Then he paused and glanced back around the side of the door. "Don't forget the umbrella," he howled, and slammed the door before turning back to Fleur. "Should I have ordered a drink for you? I could have, but you don't deserve it. Still, we're alone at last, aren't we?" And he gave her a look that was full of unpleasant speculation. Her heart was beating painfully fast. She took a deep breath, and it slowed slightly. "You're never really alone. Not here," she said. "Draco." "What?" "Were you serious about being the commander of his armies?" Draco shrugged, crossing his arms over his chest. "According to the prophecy, he and I are destined to rule the world together. I get to be a general with a neat little uniform, otherwise known as Chief Guy in charge of executing people Slytherin doesn't like the face of." "What has happened?" she said in a small voice. "After I fainted?" Draco unfolded his arms and went back to the armchair, throwing himself into it. "He took something out of the guts of the manticore, and then he had his servants come and bring us back here. They carried you— Wait a second," he added, his expression darkening. "Shouldn't I be the one asking you questions? Am I supposed to believe that you don't know what's going on?" "I don't know." The words spilled from her lips before she could stop them. "I don't believe you," snarled Draco. "I bet he told you exactly what was going to happen." "No, and I'm sure you're telling the truth." His voice came out on an explosive hiss, his grey eyes blazing with fury. "Wait a minute. No, you aren't, because you're a traitorous bitch who'd sell me for parts in Nocturne Alley if you could get enough galleons for it. Fleur resisted the urge to tell him that she suspected she'd get more galleons for some of his parts than others. Instead, she said, "It wasn't for me that I am here. It was for my little sister, for Gabrielle." "I don't want to hear it," he snapped, cutting her off. "Give me useful information or shut up. It's your choice." She wondered why she didn't immediately rush over and slap his face. Was it because she was so tired? Or because she felt a need to do something, anything, to expunge the memory of the look on Harry's face when the guards had surrounded him? Useful information? Slowly, she swung her legs over the side of the bed and tested them. They seemed to hold her, and she got to her feet, went over to Draco, and knelt down by the side of his chair. He seemed startled by her sudden proximity, but he didn't move away. His face was thrown into shadow, the firelight glittering off the chain of the epicelical charm so brightly that it seemed to burn at the hollow of his throat. There was a sort of wary stillness about him, a murderous calm that might have unsettled her under other circumstances, but she was too frightened by their situation to feel it. "Draco," she said quickly, "you must prepare yourself. He will come back here for you soon, and then it will be difficult." "Difficult?" "He will test you, your strength. He will show you things, awful things, things you can't imagine." Draco accomplished a one-shouldered shrug. "I can imagine some pretty bad things. I've seen Severus Snape's pajamas. Nothing can terrify me." Without thinking, she reached out and seized his wrist. "I'm serious." "So am I," he said with malicious amusement. "Those pajamas, they had little hearts on them. It was horrible." "The things are worse. They are so bad you could die from them." Draco didn't reply for a moment. Then he leaned forward, so close she could feel his breath stirring her hair, and said evenly, "What do you care if I die?" "I do care." "No, you don't." His voice was calm, his eyes on her speculative. "I told you, this is not my fault." He gave a short bark of laughter. "Not your fault? Okay, one of us has been drinking, and I'm sad to say it isn't me. Yet." She reached out again, caught at his sleeve. "Let me explain. Let me tell you why. My sister—" He cast her hand away from him so violently that it smacked against the edge of the table, sending a shooting pain up her arm. "Don't touch me." A sudden white blaze of anger lit inside her. "You are a fine one to talk about betrayal," she snarled, "after I have just seen you turn your back on the only person in your life who was ever a friend to you." Draco went white. She saw his hand go back and wondered for a moment if he was going to hit her, and resolved that if he did, she would hit him back. And then a voice cut through the buzzing of anger and exhaustion in her head, a voice that pinned them both in place, immobile as butterflies caught under glass.
"Children,"
said Salazar Slytherin from the doorway,
"when you are done fighting with each other, I require your attention."
Because the wards around Lily and James's old house prevented apparating within a half-mile radius, Lupin and Sirius apparated into Godric's Hollow High Street instead. If any of the inhabitants had noticed the two unknown wizards in their midst, they didn't show it. A small, inoffensive little wizarding town. The shop fronts along the high street were painted in shades ranging from emerald to lime, picked out with accents of blue, white, and gold. A Welsh flag snapped in the stiff breeze overhead, its gold dragons fluttering above the words "I Dainig Loch Draion Caerlin." Narrow little cobblestone streets wound through the shops and houses. In the distance, Lupin could see the rise of the hills behind the town, dark green and grey. Though it had been clear at the manor, it was cloudy here. The sky was slate-colored and lowering. Lupin shivered and pulled the collar of his traveling cloak up around his ears as they wended their way down the street that led out of town. They passed a candy shop with the display of Scrum chocolates in the window. A glowering photograph of Victor Crumb loomed over a pile of gaily wrapped sweets. Scrum, the new brand of candies personally endorsed by the famous Bulgarian seeker. And a pub called the Slug and Lettuce. James and I used to play darts there, said Sirius as they passed under the sign, which seemed to be made out of a real leaf of lettuce, out of which a small glowing slug was taking contented bites. It was the only game I was better at than him. You might have been decent at Quidditch if they let you play on your motorcycle. Lupin grinned. True, said Sirius, smiling in return. What happened to your bike anyway? Lupin asked. Sirius's smile faded. Hagrid had it for a while. Then he gave it back to me after the acquittal, but I haven't had the heart to use it. The last place I ever flew it was, well, yeah. So, where is it? I had it stored in my vault at Gringotts. Why? You want to borrow it? Not really my favourite mode of transportation, but thank you. It's a girl magnet, that bike. That's nice. Which reminds me, are you bringing anyone to the wedding? Because Narcissa has this friend who doesn't have anyone to go with, and I thought you might be willing to do us a favour and be her escort. She used to be in Aura, and she really likes dogs, so the wolf thing probably won't be a problem. Lupin paused in the middle of the street and looked at his friend with deep suspicion. Are you trying to set me up, Sirius? What? No, said Sirius, looking indescribably shifty. Never. Padfoot. Sirius abandoned all effort at pretense. Oh, come on, Moony. You need to get out more. Meet someone. I always thought I would be the last bachelor, but you... Well, aren't you bored? Lupin growled. For your information, I lead a rich and varied social life. Oh, I know. Every night you're reading all of your back issues of Arthromancer's Weekly and drinking a hot cup of cocoa. I'm a werewolf, Sirius. And I'm a Gemini. We all have our crosses to bear. You just want me in the same boat with you. Incidentally, when is this wedding of yours set to take place anyway? Narcissa had it scheduled for the 15th of August. The 15th of August? Lupin repeated, sounding almost glum. Is that a problem? Sirius turned and smiled again at his friend, pushing back the dark hair the wind had whipped across his eyes. Have you got plans? It's a full moon that night, said Lupin flatly. Sirius stopped dead in his tracks in the middle of the road that led away from the high street and up the hill towards the Potter's house. Moony, I'm sorry. I stopped keeping track of full moons after Hogwarts, he admitted, unable to decide whether he should laugh or look abashed. You can still go to the wedding, you know. No, interrupted Lupin self-righteously, starting to walk again. I think I'll stay home and, not eat the wedding party. Sirius scurried after him. We can change the date, he said, sounding aggrieved. It wouldn't be a proper wedding without you. I mean, you're meant to be the best man. Moony, don't sulk. I'm not sulking. You are. I'm not. You are. I can tell. Maybe, conceded Lupin, shoving his hands in his pockets. But it took your mind off where we're going, didn't it? We're here, by the way. Sirius stopped. All his nervous motion suddenly quelled into stillness as he looked past his friend's shoulder at the ruins just over the rise of the hill. A grid of stones ran along the earth, showing where the walls had been, the front steps, the door where Sirius had last seen James and Lily standing, waving goodbye. Lupin shivered again in the cold wind and looked sideways at Sirius. He was staring at the house. Well, not quite at it, but past it. The look of controlled disquiet was gone from his face, and his eyes were filled with memory and pain. Lupin felt much the same. In unison, they began to move forward towards the house. Now they were standing in what had been the potter's backyard. It was not as overgrown as one might have expected. The spell that kept the house hidden had the side effect of keeping the property in a partial kind of stasis. The grass was long, reaching nearly to Lupin's knees as he trudged after Sirius, who was heading with some purpose towards a corner of the yard, then stopped at the base of a very tall evergreen tree and stared at it. Lupin came up behind him, shuffling his feet through the grass. The wind made a whispering sound through the leaves as he looked at the tree. Mutely, Sirius took out his wand and pointed it at the dark hole in the trunk about half a foot overhead. "Accio," he said, and, like birds flying out of a dove-cote, objects began hurling themselves out of the tree, small, irregularly shaped objects. Lupin ducked as a small box whizzed by his right ear and turned to look inquiringly at Sirius. "What the—" Sirius stood looking thoughtful as the last object flew towards him and caught it in his hand. Then he knelt in the grass, and Lupin knelt with him, and began examining the pile that had collected at his feet. Some of the objects were familiar. Lupin recognized, with a pang, the box of Zonko's magical reality pencils that had been used to draw the Marauders map, a stack of letters bearing Lily's handwriting that he hadn't seen before, tied together with parchment written all over in James's boyish handwriting, a pile of old Quidditch cards, which doubtless would be worth a sizable amount of galleons these days, and another stack of letters, which were decorated all over with little sparkling hearts and shooting stars, who seemed to be from girls named Ashley, Carol, and Amy. Sirius cleared his throat nervously as he glanced at these and hastily pushed them aside. There was also a bag of Bertie Bott's Every Flavor beans, emblazoned with rainbows. "Flower power flavors," it said on the side of the bag. Sirius picked it up and grinned. "Remember these? You weren't supposed to eat the purple ones because they were hallucinogenic. Of course, that was just a rumor." "Yes, and you and James tested the rumor by sneaking 3 of them into Snape's oatmeal at breakfast. That was the day he nearly drowned in the lake because he thought he was the Lord of the Deep and could breathe underwater." "Yeah, that was hilarious." Sirius grinned, then quickly sobered. "No, it wasn't. It was very insensitive of us." Lupin looked at him in disbelief. "Sirius, did you sneak a purple bean while I wasn't looking?" Sirius grinned again and threw the beans aside. He picked up a wooden box and flipped back the lid. Lupin looked and felt his heart skip a beat when he beheld what lay inside. A yellow-bound book. "So you want to be a Wolverine? How to become an animagus in 12 difficult steps." And a stack of wizard photographs held together with a ribbon that Sirius slid into a pocket. Finally, he sat back on his heels, closed the lid of the box, and shook his head. "Not what you wanted?" asked Lupin, raising his eyebrows. "No," said Sirius slowly. "You know, James once told me that this tree had been here for hundreds of years, and that generations of potters had used it as a hiding place. I thought I could have sworn." Then he suddenly hopped to his feet, snapping his fingers. "Of course! It's buried under the roots. Stand back a second, Moony." With misgivings, Lupin did so. Sirius retrieved his wand from his pocket. "Accio shovel," he intoned. Lupin's eyes popped open. "A shovel? From where, Sirius?" "Wherever's nearest," deadpanned the other. "Oh, and duck." And as Lupin did so, a good-sized shovel whistled over his head and landed in Sirius's grasp. Lupin crossed his arms and watched in mingled exasperation and amusement as Sirius rolled up the sleeves of his robes and attacked the base of the tree with the shovel. Since his manner discouraged assistance, Lupin sat down on a tree stump and watched as his friend hacked at the very hard ground with the edge of the shovel. Eventually, Sirius stripped off his wizarding robes and threw them on the ground, and then his sweater followed. Lupin considered offering a hand, but then thought better of it. Instead, he took a bar of chocolate out of his pocket and began to nibble on it in a resigned fashion. They were obviously going to be there a while. After several minutes had gone by, Lupin had eaten all his chocolate and played several games of nuts and crosses with himself by scribbling on the empty candy wrappers. But finally there was a triumphant "Aha!" from Sirius, and Lupin stood up and walked over to his friend. Under the tree, a dark, hollow space was revealed, obviously engineered by men. It was shallow and lined with stone to keep out the damp. As Lupin approached, he caught the sharp glint of light off the side of something metal inside the hollow. It was a long casket of some sort, which Sirius picked up and held up to the light. Too transparent to be adamantine, Lupin suspected it was made of some kind of adamant derivative. An anxious expression flickered across Sirius's face as he turned the box over, running his thumb across the smooth material, and stopped when he came to a dark, irregular-shaped keyhole. Reaching into his pocket, he drew out the silver key set with red stones and slid the end of it into the lock. The box clicked open as readily as if it had been locked only yesterday. Setting it down, Sirius ratcheted back the lid and lifted out the object that lay inside. It was as long as his arm and made of silver, the scabbard to a sword, engraved all over with brilliant designs of flowers, animals, and leaves that flowed together intricately to form the word Gryffindor. Demons, Demons, Demons turned out to be a book so long, detailed, and nearly incomprehensible that Narcissa soon despaired of making any sort of useful sense out of it. It was 5 o'clock, and she was only on Abaddon, King of the Abyss, who supposedly opened the gates of hell and unleashed upon the earth his swarms of demon locusts. "Demon locusts," she groaned. "Give me a break." "Demon locusts are no joke," came a dry voice from behind her. "They can really ruin a picnic." She spun around and saw a familiar head and shoulders floating in the fireplace. Dark eyes regarded her narrowly. "Severus," she said, "you scared me." Snape inclined his head. "I'm sorry. I was looking for—" "Sirius?" Snape looked ever so slightly shifty. "Yes." "Well, he isn't here, and I don't know when he'll be back. Can I give him a message?" Snape hesitated for a moment, then nodded curtly. "I thought he might want to know that I translated the fire letters on the wall of the cell where—" His voice trailed off. "Where Lucius died. You can say it, Severus." "Where he was murdered." Snape held up a folded piece of parchment. "It's a demon-banishing incantation." "You mean a demon-summoning incantation?" "No, I mean what I said. I think he must have called something up, not liked what he saw, and tried to banish it, to no avail. I believe the banishing curse is demon-specific as well, but since Black borrowed my demonology text, I can't do a match." "Ah," said Narcissa. "Well," she held out her hand for the parchment, and after a moment of hesitation, Snape relinquished it. "I'll give it to Sirius when he returns." "Very well." Snape nodded curtly and vanished. Narcissa sat for a moment, staring at the parchment in her hand. Then she rose to her feet and went into the drawing room. With a quick "Alohomora," she opened the trap door that led to the dungeons. She had never much liked the corridors under Malfoy Manor, and they were even worse when she was alone. Holding her wand high, she took a deep breath before she pushed open the dungeon gate. It gave a rusty scream which sent shivers up her spine. The demon was awake, as she had expected, and rather doubted that such creatures slept at all. It regarded her with whirling red eyes as she approached its cell. Without preamble, she stopped dead in front of it and said, "Demon, what do you want?" Its whirling eyes widened.
"What does any prisoner want? To go free?"
I will gladly send you back to hell on one condition. Its twisted little face stretched into an ugly, rictus-like grin.
A bargain, eh? Tell me more. I'm all ears.
The Snake Lord stood in the doorway, his eyes alight, and Draco heard Fleur get to her feet beside him. There was a heavy, sweet scent that clung about her hair and clothes that he noticed as she did so. It made him a little dizzy. "Master," she said, and inclined her head. Draco lowered his hand slowly and turned to look at Slytherin. The Snake Lord took a few more steps forward until he stood in the center of the room, and Draco could tell by the dark red border of blood at the bottom of his robes that he had not yet changed his clothes. His eyes were alight, feverish, and 2 spots of color burned high on his cheeks. He looked neither alive nor dead, but somehow in between, reflexively animate.
"Boy,"
he said to Draco.
"you won't greet me."
"I won't call you master," said Draco evenly. Slytherin seemed unruffled.
"I would not expect you to."
Draco narrowed his eyes. "What would you like me to call you?"
"Soon enough,"
said Slytherin.
"you will call me father."
"Yeah, you know that word doesn't really have very good associations for me. Maybe I could call you something else. Something friendly, like Nigel?" Slytherin smiled.
"After this evening, you may feel differently. Do you know what I have planned?"
"I was hoping for a night at the opera, dinner, maybe some flowers. Then we take a walk under the stars. You make a move, I tell you I'm not that kind of guy." Beside Draco, Fleur gave a frightened little squeak. Slytherin smiled again, a smile with no humor in it, a sort of reflexive muscle spasm rather than any expression of actual pleasure.
"Come with me,"
he demanded.
"both of you."
And he walked out of the room. Fleur dashed after him, and Draco followed more slowly. They went through a series of narrow hallways and eventually emerged into a much larger room, almost circular in shape and nearly empty. The walls were cut from the same rough stone as the rest of the castle, and on the floor a large circle had been drawn in chalk. Tall screens were fetched up against the far wall. They looked to be carved out of dragon bone, and the intricate designs which adorned them were set with chips of jade, silver, and malachite. They were beautiful, but the sight of them made Draco immediately wonder what they were hiding. The thought made him glance sideways at Fleur. She was very pale, and looked as if she might faint again. Slytherin walked forward into the room until he stood at the very center of the chalked circle. Then he held out his left hand to Draco.
"Come here,"
he said. Reluctantly, Draco followed and felt a shudder ripple through him as he crossed the chalk line. The air inside the circle appeared to have grown 10 degrees colder, the chill seeming to come from somewhere deep inside.
"Now,"
said the Snake Lord,
"would you prefer to suffer standing up or kneeling down?"
Draco blinked, not wanting to believe that he had heard correctly. "Suffer?"
"It's your choice."
said Slytherin, his voice dry and cool as snakeskin.
"I believe in nothing if not free will. Give me your hand. Your left hand."
Numbly, Draco gave it to him.
"I'll ask you again.
Said the Snake Lord.
Would you prefer to suffer standing or kneeling?"
There was a silence. Then finally Draco said, "Standing,"
"I thought you would say that."
said Slytherin, and turned Draco's hand palm up, pushing his sleeve to the elbow as he did so, exposing the unmarked skin of his forearm.
"Potestatem Patris nostrae in tenebris invoco."
hissed Slytherin, and suddenly the chalk circle turned into a ring of fire that burned around them. The Snake Lord grinned, and this time there was mirth in his smile, and a light in his eyes, although That could have just been the reflection of the fire.
Prosiatura.
He cried. A white blade of pain shot through Draco, as if Slytherin had driven a knife into his arm. He cried out, and, much as he had wanted to stand, he found he couldn't. His knees went out from under him, and he hit the floor. Slytherin released his grip, and Draco writhed and curled in on himself, conscious only of the pain that speared through his arm and raced up his veins and threatened to stop his heart. White light burst behind his eyes, painting silver on his inner lids, and suddenly it stopped. Draco lay still, his eyes closed, waiting. When the pain did not return, he opened them and sat up slowly, aching all over, his arm burning as if it had been held in a fire. He turned it palm up, knowing already what he would see. A skull with grinning jaws and empty eye sockets that mocked him, and a snake protruding from its mouth to slither its way down his forearm. Signal serpens, the dark mark. A little hopeless sobbing sound broke the silence. For a horrified moment, Draco thought it had come from him. Then he realized it had been Fleur. Twisting around, he saw her face, paper white and tears flooding down her cheeks. Slytherin let out an impatient sigh.
If you cannot control yourself, girl, then go and lie down. You're useless to me if you aren't strong.
With a brief, miserable nod, Fleur raced out of the room. Why didn't you tell her the truth? Draco demanded, raising his head.
And what truth would that be?
The fact that she's dying. It wasn't a question,
They're all dying.
said Slytherin, unmoved by this turn of conversation.
She is just dying a little more rapidly than most. Rest assured that she will live as long as she is needed to do what I require of her.
And I think I know what that is, said Draco. Both of us are in one room, one bed. What are you trying to do? We're not cocker spaniels, you know. You can't just go around mating us,
But it would amuse me to do so.
said Slytherin. Well, if that's the case, said Draco a little hastily. His mind was only on half of the conversation. The rest of it was mainly taken up with the immense effort it seemed to be taking to sit up. I guess I'll be running along then. See if Slytherin's voice lashed at him like a whip.
You will stay right here. I have not finished with you. We have only just begun.
He made a flicking gesture with his left hand, and Draco found himself propelled to his feet. His legs held him, just barely, and he could feel cold sweat trickling down the back of his neck, stinging and icy.
I need your loyalty,
Said the Snake Lord.
your obedience, but you must never forget that mine is the greater power.
If you are so strong, began Draco, then why did you need us to fight the Manticore? Slytherin looked not the least bit discomposed.
Clever question. I do not have my powers now, it is true, which is why I've been using the half-Veela girl, and she is nearly drained. But when I open the orb, all my powers will be returned to me.
Well then, what are you waiting for? Draco snapped. He assumed that the orb was the shining object that Slytherin had taken from the Manticore's body. Open it,
Not yet.
said Slytherin.
First, the Gryffindor boy must suffer.
Harry. Draco felt as if someone had balled up all the misery and tension in the room and jammed it hard into his solar plexus. What does Potter's suffering have to do with anything?
Without my powers, I am not really myself, and the demons cannot find me to extract the payment I cheated them of long ago. They do not see as people do. They sense the essence of a person, their life spark. First, I must appease the demons with blood, and hell will be satisfied.
You can't kill Harry, Draco protested suddenly. Slytherin's smile narrowed.
You defend
Draco straightened up. I'm not defending him, but clearly you don't know his history. He defeated the most powerful dark wizard of our time when he was a baby. His life is charred, literally. There's some protection on him. I'm not sure it'd be such a good idea if you just bat a cadaver at him. The last guy who tried that spent 13 years eking out life as a banana slug in Bulgaria before he got his body back.
Yes, Fleur told me all that,
said Slytherin, looking thoughtful.
But rest assured that when I have the use of my powers again, that I will dispose of this Lord Voldemort.
No honor among thieves? Inquired Draco.
No use for a spare dark wizard cluttering up the playing field,
said Slytherin. Draco shut his eyes. There was a buzzing in his ears, and his arm throbbed as if it had been torn at by savage wolves.
You are in pain, aren't you?
Said Slytherin, sounding abstractly curious. Yes, said Draco through clenched teeth. You know I am.
Why do you not use your magic to help with that? Are you not a magician and my heir? You could heal yourself with a thought, if you let me show you how.
Draco shook his head, but said nothing.
Ah,
said the Snake Lord, as if he finally understood.
You fear that if you use your powers, that you will lose your soul, your identity. But what identity do you have? That given to you by your father, or forced on you by those you think are your friends? You don't even understand yourself. You see the world too simply. The covenant that holds the world together calls for opposites, the dark and the light, uniformity and chaos. Each path needs the other to survive. Without demons, there would be no angels. Without Slytherin, there would be no Gryffindor. Without Draco Malfoy...
No, Harry Potter, said Draco flatly. I get it. I'm not stupid.
Then don't behave as if you are. You have powers many would kill to possess. Use them.
You can't do good with the powers that come from hell, Draco said bitterly.
Why not? There are angels of death as there are angels of destruction. Perhaps you are neither one thing nor the other, neither angel nor demon, purely evil nor purely good. But you are the heir of Slytherin, and you belong to me.
Why do you want me to be like you so badly? Draco demanded, feeling his face flush with angry blood. I won't be happy, you know, being what you are. Did that occur to you? Slytherin's voice dropped several octaves, turning silky and quiet.
I could make her love you,
he said, and Draco flinched.
The love potion was unsatisfactory, I know, but I could make her love you and know no difference.
Draco closed his eyes, seeing Hermione in Slytherin's tower, how his body had reacted when she had kissed him, and the traitorous elation he had felt knowing that emotion was for him, not Harry. He opened his eyes, blinking away the memory. No, he said, there is a price for such happiness as that.
There's a price for everything,
said Slytherin airily.
but I can see that you still do not understand. Come over here, and I will show you what I mean.
He turned and pointed his hand at the far wall where the heavy screens stood, their brilliant designs of writhing dragons so bright it hurt Draco's eyes. A spark shot from Slytherin's hand, and the screens ratcheted back, folding outward to reveal what had been hidden behind them. It was a mirror, as tall as he was, shaped like an upright diamond and thickly framed in gold, and stood on two large clawed feet. It seemed very similar to the Mirror of Erised, which Draco had only glanced at when he had seen it at Hogwarts. A great deal of artistry had gone into the carving of the frame, which was alive with the shapes of leaves and animals. Above the peak of the mirror were 3 carved words, Nisi Te Ipsum.
Slytherin reached out and grasped Draco by the arm and dragged him forward so that he stood in front of the mirror.
This is not the mirror of desire that shows men the wishes of their hearts,
said Slytherin, his cold breath on Draco's neck making him shudder.
This mirror was made to be its opposite.
His hand slid around Draco's neck to clasp his chin and force his head up.
This is called the mirror of judgment. It shows you what you really are.
A shudder like a bolt of lightning went through Draco, and he tried to twist away, but Slytherin held him hard in his grip.
Look,
hissed the Snake Lord, and shook Draco hard.
Open your eyes.
Draco's eyes flew open, and he looked.
So that's your bargain,
said the demon, looking narrowly at Narcissa.
You will send me back to hell in exchange for information.
Narcissa nodded. I know Slytherin will try to kill one of them, either Harry or my son. I want to know if there's any way that can be prevented, that you can be forced to take him instead.
The powers of hell cannot be forced,
the demon replied, its eyes spinning in concentric circles of red and gold. Then how can the end of this bargain be accomplished? How is it consummated? Explain. The demon shook its head.
Take the walls off the cell.
Swear first, she said. Swear that you won't harm me when I release you, and swear that there is a way that Slytherin can be taken, instead of my son or Harry.
I swear it,
said the demon, and Narcissa stepped towards the bars of the cell and dismantled the wards. That accomplished, she pointed her wand at the demon and read off the words of the banishing charm. As she reached the end of the incantation, a burst of flame leapt up and circled it. Now tell me, she demanded. Tell me what I want to know. The demon looked straight at her.
In the original bargain, Slytherin promised us a magid heir of his own blood, and that is what he will take. Unless the Snake Lord can be persuaded to offer up the sword willingly with his own hand, in which case we will take him instead.
With his own hand? Narcissa echoed faintly. The demon nodded. But he'll never do that! She cried furiously, and flung herself towards the bars, but the fire had made them red hot, and she jumped back.
Really not my problem,
the demon replied, and vanished with a wink in a burst of flame. Creak. A sudden rattling sound split the air in the cell, and Harry looked up to see the dark space in the far wall open to its fullest extent, and 2 guards wrapped in grey robes came in, and after them, Draco, looking the same as he always had, but somehow changed. His clothes were different, although that wasn't it. Not exactly. The fabric of black clothes made him look unreal, like a chess piece rather than a person. In fact, he looked as if he had been refined down to his most essential elements, as if everything unnecessary had been burned away. Draco started forward, crossing the room to where Harry sat, the guards trailing behind him as silently as ghosts. Harry raised his head as Draco approached, looking at him steadily, and did not change expression as Draco got gracefully down on his knees in front of him, so that their gazes were level. "Well, Potter," he said at last, and the drawling tone of his voice sent arrows of cold fire shooting through Harry's veins. "It looks like you've really hacked old Slithy off." Harry stared at him evenly, but said nothing. "If I could be so bold as to say, I wouldn't want to be in your chains," Draco continued, in the same conversational tone, as if Harry weren't chained to the floor and covered in blood. "Earlier today you were in my chains," said Harry evenly. "But I guess you figured a way out, didn't you, Malfoy?" he added without expression. Draco grinned, without humor. Harry's chains rattled as he leaned back against the wall with an exasperated sigh. "What do you want?" "What do I want?" Draco repeated in the same dead voice. World peace, Potter. A suede coat that won't get ruined in the rain. A broomstick that'll do Mach 2. Oh, and some of your blood. Harry blinked. My blood? Draco turned and looked over his shoulder at one of the faceless grey-robed guards. Unchain his wrist, he said, and then added with a nasty grin. His left wrist. Harry watched as the guard reached forward and, none too gently, freed his hand from one cuff. The whole time, Draco retained an indifferent expression, even as he reached into Harry's shirt pocket and produced his pocket knife. Harry made it a point not to struggle or try to get away. He just watched Draco through suspicious green eyes as he flicked the blade of the knife open and tested its edge with a finger. Malfoy, he said quietly, you don't have to do this. I'll die if I don't, Draco replied in a voice that was monotone, as if it was quite out of his control. There are worse things than dying. You should know that. A little of the old wicked sparkle shot across Draco's expression as he turned Harry's hand over in his grip so that it rested palm up and placed the edge of the blade against the inside of Harry's wrist. Do you remember when you sliced open my hand with this? He said, still conversationally. Yes, said Harry, and even though you seem to have momentarily lost your senses, I'd do the same thing again. Draco's hand, where it held the knife, jerked almost imperceptibly, but he recovered himself quickly. Leaning forward, he whispered into Harry's ear. Since both of us are likely to die anyway, I thought I'd tell you, Potter. When I died, it wasn't all blackness. I went to a place in between life and death, where the murdered are waiting to be avenged. I saw your parents. This time it was Harry who jerked, and the edge of the knife bit down into his arm, but he barely felt it. His green eyes were riveted to Draco's, even as one of the grey-robed servants darted forward and pressed a square cloth over the bleeding cut. Within moments it was soaked in scarlet, and the cloth was retracted as the servant retreated. You're lying, Harry said, his voice coming out in a hoarse whisper. You must be. Why would I lie about something as trivial as that? Trivial? Harry repeated, horrified. Why didn't you tell me? Sirius told me not to, Draco replied, his tone almost flippant. But since we're here now, I thought you might as well know. They've been there all this time. All the time you were growing up, they've been waiting for someone to come and avenge them. But that'll probably never happen because, face it, for them to be avenged, someone would have to kill the Dark Lord. And I'm not sure that's possible. Not now, not ever. Shut up, said Harry, his voice dangerously low. If you're so certain of that, why the hell didn't you tell me any of this before? Why tell me now? What good would it have done to tell you before? Draco asked. Slytherin intends to kill you, and I thought it would be better for you to die knowing what I saw in the grey spaces. The truth is better than a lie, and the truth is that they won't be waiting for you on the other side. Draco stood up, bracing himself for Harry to yell at him, but Harry didn't. He just sat there, shaking. Draco could feel the anger coming off of him in waves, and he wondered why he had said the things he said. When he had made the rash decision to tell Harry everything he had seen, he had thought that preparing him for the disappointment of death might make Harry angry enough to break his chains. But perhaps he had been wrong. Harry was angry, all right, but the shape was different than anything Draco had seen so far from him. When Harry did speak again, it was in a deadly cold voice. Drop dead, Malfoy. Already have done, mate. Harry heard the knife as Draco flipped it shut and felt it as he put it back into his pocket. He could see the blood on the other boy's hands now and on his cloak. Harry looked back up at him. At least tell me how I'm going to die, he said quietly. You owe me that much. Draco looked at him for a long moment. When it comes, he said, it will be quick. And he walked back through the door, the guards trailing like grey shadows in his wake. It had started to rain, and the grass around Sirius and Lupin's feet was wet and beginning to soak through the cuffs of their trousers as they waded on the hillside. Their heads and shoulders were dry, however, thanks to the parapluius charm Lupin had cast after they left the Potter house. Aside from the small silver whistle which Sirius had produced from the pocket of his robes and blown without indicating to Lupin what it was for, he had been too absorbed in staring at the scabbard to pay much attention to the weather. "What are we waiting for again, Sirius?" Lupin queried, shivering slightly in the bitter wind and interrupting Sirius's reverie. "All right," said Sirius, and suddenly they heard the flap of wings and spun around to see a small, apricot-colored horned owl. Lupin blinked. "Little small to carry both of us, don't you think?" he asked, as the bird settled on Sirius's shoulder and pecked gently at his ear. Sirius took the parchment that had been tied to its leg and unrolled it as the owl took off again, pale wings beating hard against the dark sky. "It's from Narcissa," he said, when he had finished and handed the letter over to Lupin. "She wrung some information out of that demon, apparently. Nothing too useful, though." Lupin scanned the letter and was about to reply when a large shadow blotted out what little light the weak sun had been casting on the parchment. He looked up and saw the circling form of a huge animal coming down towards them. The body of a horse, ornamented by the wings and head of an eagle's and a lion's thrashing tail. The hippogriff landed on the grass just ahead of them and strode over to Sirius. "Buckbeak?" Lupin demanded, turning to Sirius as the hippogriff ducked his head against his master's shoulder, and Sirius was about to reach up and stroke his feathered head when the hippogriff stiffened and was staring past him, eyes narrowed. "Beaky, what?" Sirius began, and turned to follow the anxious hippogriff's gaze. He saw Lupin, standing with his arms folded, his robes swirling about him in the stiff wind like black folded wings. "It's me, Sirius," he said, and shook his head a fraction. "What do you mean?" "He senses I'm a werewolf," said Lupin, looking tensely at Buckbeak, who had started to back away slightly. "He's afraid of me." "Afraid of you? No offense, but if it came to hand-to-beak combat, I think he could take you." "That's not the point," replied Lupin irritably. "Look, I know animals don't like you, but I thought a magical creature like Buckbeak... I mean, Grindylows don't mind you." "Those are dark creatures. Also, have you forgotten third year at Hogwarts when he practically killed me with those hooves of his?" Sirius at least had the sense to look abashed at that, and rested his head briefly on Buckbeak's side. "Be that as it may, I don't see another way for us to get to where we're going. I'm sure there are wards up all around the castle. We'll get splinched for sure if we try to apparate." Lupin shook his head and took a halting step towards Sirius. Buckbeak reared back, nearly knocking Sirius over. Sirius ducked out of the way, narrowly avoiding being smacked in the face with one of the hippogriff's wildly beating wings. "Beaky," he snapped. "Buckbeak, settle down." But Buckbeak didn't look like he wanted to settle down. He continued to plunge and rear, eyes rolling wildly. Lupin didn't come any closer, but stood where he was, not moving. "Buckbeak," said Sirius again, his voice low and soothing, pulling the hippogriff towards him. Lupin watched, feeling apprehension curdle in the pit of his stomach. After a while, Sirius seemed to have calmed Buckbeak down enough that he was able to conjure a silver rope, which wound itself around the hippogriff's neck, while the other hardened and reshaped itself, becoming a handle in Sirius's fist. Gripping the leash firmly, he turned back to look at Lupin. "Come on, Remus," he said. Lupin approached slowly, reached out, and laid a hand against Buckbeak's flank. The hippogriff flinched, his skin rippling under Lupin's touch, but he did not move away. Lupin raised his eyes and saw Sirius grinning at him. "See?" he said, catching his breath. "Easy." Lupin didn't say anything. He let Sirius help him up on Buckbeak's back and sat still while his friend clambered up behind him. He could still feel the hippogriff's skin writhing and twitching where he touched it, and knew that Buckbeak suffered him as a rider only out of love for Sirius. Still, it was better than the alternative. Once they were in the air, Buckbeak seemed to be able to ignore the presence of Lupin on his back, and responded to Sirius's reassuring caresses with faint clucks that could only be interpreted as affectionate. Lupin tensed again, however, when they reached a dark stretch of forest. He took a deep breath. The sight of those vast expanse of trees stirred within him memories of being called, memories that weren't really memories at all, but more primal than that. He knew the forest, knew the paths through it, knew, as he reached forward to tap Sirius on the shoulder, where they needed to descend to find the grey towered castle surrounded by thickly branching trees. Chirruping with anxiety, Buckbeak allowed himself to be encouraged to land just inside the walls that surrounded the castle. But as soon as Sirius and Lupin dismounted, he took off again, wings pumping vigorously as he vanished over the treetops. Sirius smiled wryly. I guess he doesn't much like this place either. Lupin turned his attention to their surroundings. Without ever having been there before, he felt a stabbing sense of recognition as they approached. The high walls of smooth black were familiar, as was the overgrown garden that surrounded the castle proper. The few visible windows were so very high up that there was no chance of climbing. Sirius tipped his head back and glanced around. So, what do we do now? Lupin shrugged. This is as much outside my experience as it is yours. Why ask me? Because you're a problem solver. You're one of those people who will pick up a ball of yarn that's gotten all tangled up and spend an entire day untangling it. You like this sort of thing. No, I don't. Oh, yes, you do. Lupin gave him an annoyed look and returned his attention to the castle and its Everons. The only entrance he could see into the structure was a set of huge, intricately carved front doors. Well, I don't think we can just walk up to the front door and knock. Oh, yeah? Lupin glanced at him, but Sirius was already striding towards the doors, and he had no choice but to race after him. He wasn't sure exactly why, but he'd had some practice in preventing Sirius from getting killed before. If necessary, he felt he could do it again. For a moment he thought that Sirius was about to walk right up to the entrance, when he seemed to change his mind, and went along the side where a tall, arched doorway with intricately carved architrave was half hidden by vines and creepers. Sirius pushed them aside and knocked. A moment later, the door was opened by a tall woman in long grey robes that showed off an impressive hourglass figure. She was quite tall, with long black hair that reached past her waist to her knees. Her eyes were large and very dark, her lips blood red, her teeth white and even. She smiled when she saw Lupin and Sirius. Well, hello there, she purred. Did you just come by to say hello, or have the man-eating trolls finally found a restaurant that delivers? Sirius seemed to be busy putting his eyes back in and had nothing to say. Lupin shouldered him aside. I'm Remus Lupin. I'm a werewolf, he said. I'm answering the call. She raised two delicately dark eyebrows curiously. Most of the werewolves arrived 2 days ago. That was my fault, Sirius put in hastily. The dark-haired beauty's gaze slid over to him, and for a moment, Sirius was at a loss for how to continue. Yes, said Lupin, picking up where Sirius left off. He's a vampire, you see, so it took us a while to get here because we could only travel at night. Now she was looking at Sirius with interest. You're a vampire? Yes, his name is William the Bloody, said Lupin, elaborating. He's quite well known for his viciousness and some bloodthirstiness. Are you the guardian here? He asked, hoping to change the subject. Is there someone else we should be speaking to? You can speak to me. I'm on watch. My name is Raven. There was a bright spark that might have been suspicion, or could have been something else, as she ran her gaze over Lupin and turned to Sirius. A vampire and a werewolf traveling together seems impractical. She leaned against the door jamb, inhaling with great effect. But either way, I have to ask you both the questions.
The questions? Sirius echoed, snapping to life.
There are 3. First would be, what manner of dark creature are you? But I guess you've already answered that. Then there's, have you come here to be cleansed?
Cleansed? Echoed Lupin, briefly thrown.
Yes, said Raven severely. Your souls must be cleansed of humanity.
Sure, said Sirius in a strangled sort of voice.
And the final question, Raven continued, now staring at Sirius with immense interest. Are you willing to accept the Snake Lord as your master and acknowledge the superiority of pure wizarding blood?
Lupin could feel Sirius go very still behind him, but decided that now was not the time to engage in a fight about blood status.
We are, he announced.
Without saying anything, she leaned back against the open door, creating enough space for them to pass, although not quite enough space for them to pass without brushing against her. Once they were inside, she shut the door behind them and picked up a small lantern which glowed with an intense blue light.
Follow me, she said, and started off down the hall.
What is she? Sirius whispered to Lupin as they followed the rather mesmerizing sway of Raven's hips down the hallway.
I'd guess she's a banshee, Lupin whispered back. And have I mentioned that when there are pretty girls around, you suck it under cover? Now, shut up.
Raven slowed down a little as they turned a corner. Lupin glanced around with great interest. So, this was the stronghold of Salazar Slytherin. The walls were ancient stone that bore the marks of tools used to hollow out a passageway. The ceilings beamed in dark, heavy wood. Everywhere there were serpents, carved snakes that writhed up and down the architraves and adorned the gleaming bronze torch brackets. They turned another corner and Raven looked at them again.
We're here,
she announced, pausing in front of a large ivory door. Or at least Lupin would have thought it was ivory, if any creature alive was large enough to yield such unbroken sheets of whiteness. He blinked, and the door swung partly open under Raven's touch. She glanced at him.
You go here for the testing.
But he turned to look at Sirius. Raven looked annoyed.
We are segregated here, she snapped. Werewolves separated from Velas, banshees from trolls, unless you really want to bunk with the Dementors.
Lupin glanced towards the half-open door.
That room is full of werewolves,
he asked, wondering if this meant by extension that Sirius would soon have to cope with a room full of vampires.
You say that like it's a bad thing,
said Raven, and prodded him inside. He barely had a chance to glance at Sirius before the door shut between them with a metallic clang of a portcullis crashing down, cutting his friend off from view. Lupin coughed and looked around a little nervously. He was in a large stone room designed almost like an amphitheater, whose high ceiling vanished into mist. No, it wasn't mist. It was smoke. A cloying, sweetish smoke that filled the room with vapors. There was a low central stage sunk into the floor and ringed around with large benches piled high with beaded cushions. And sprawled on the cushions were a number of figures he couldn't quite make out, although they were obviously human. Not human, he reminded himself. Lycanthropes, or the werewolves, like me. The thought was unsettling. "Hello there," called a voice in a distinctly American accent, and a figure evolved out of the smoke at his side. "Catch!" Something flew at Lupin's face, and without thinking, he picked it out of the air and held it for a moment. It was an object shaped like a wand, with one sharp end, the other decorated with a glass bauble of some sort. It gave a brief flash of light when he touched it, and then went dark. "Right then,"
You're one of us, said the werewolf, plucking the wand-like thing out of Lupin's hand and making it disappear into his robes. That was the test. You passed. Congratulations. What's your name? Lupin introduced himself, then blinked around. Now what? Hell if I know, said the werewolf, looking gloomy. Well, who's in charge here? Lupin demanded. I am, replied his companion, looking even more gloom-ridden. But only because, well, look at what I have to work with. The werewolf swept an arm towards the rest of the room, which Lupin was able to see a bit more clearly now. It seemed as if there were 30 or 40 werewolves total, all of whom were recognizable only as dim shapes, sitting or lounging around on the cushions, giggling and poking each other. Bunch of apathetic, useless, long-haired cubs, the werewolf muttered. I tell you, all the fighting spirit's been bred out of us over the centuries. The fiercest of us were slaughtered. Look what's left. Bunch of wimps. Hey, you got anything to eat on you? No, Lupin replied absently, still scanning the room. You mean Slytherin? The Snake Lord just lets you loll about here like this, not doing anything. Where are your battle plans? Your strategies? I wrote a few strategic plans on the chalkboard, but nobody's paid attention. You sure you don't have any food? Hippogriff crunchies, maybe? Lamb pops? Go crisps? Peanuts? I said no, Lupin replied, and squinted down at the board at the foot of the amphitheater. It appeared to be a white chalkboard, on which was written in dark green ink, Plans for World Domination. Also, it looked like someone had been playing noughts and crosses. And that's all you've got? Pretty much. This is our war council. I hear the trolls are a lot better organized. This doesn't look like a setup for a war council, Lupin said irritably. This looks like a setup for a poetry reading. The werewolf chortled. I like the way you think, he said. How'd you like to be an admiral? Or possibly a baron? You can help me whip these pups into shape. Plan strategy. What do you think? I think admiral is a naval term, and I'm not prepared to be a baron either. But I'll be a general. He thrust out his hand towards the werewolf, not sure if that was proper etiquette, but willing to risk it. After a moment, the other took his hand and shook it. General Lupin, he said. Welcome to the war. And that is all for this particular chapter, guys. Quotes. The covenant that holds the world together calls for opposites, the dark and the light, uniformity and chaos, is from the Book of Magic by Neil Gaiman. Let's just say I wouldn't want to be in your chains is from Angel. If I totally messed up pronouncing that banner under the Welsh flag, it's because I don't speak Welsh, and I'm so sorry. If there's anyone who is listening to this who is Welsh, I'm sorry. I don't know anything. I tried. But yeah, other than that, guys, thank you so much for joining me for this. Like always, if you can like, comment, share my stuff, subscribe to the channel, I would be much appreciative. And also, if you could check out the links in my About section here on YouTube, I have a Patreon and a Ko-fi. So if you would like to support me monetarily on either of those, I do have artwork that comes out on my Patreon at the $2 tier and more spicy content at the higher tier. But I also with my Ko-fi, that is just something that if you really, just don't feel like art, but you want to give me something for my reading efforts, that would also be much appreciated as well. And triple also for the 14 days of Valentine's, I will be releasing more of my fan fiction that my girlfriend and I wrote way back in our preteen eras, just like I did during the 12 days of Christmas. I unearthed some gold. So if you are interested in that, that will be a Patreon exclusive. And yeah, guys, thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you all in the next one. Good night.